Welcome again to Father Paul's talk today. We begin with a reading from St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25. We have these words. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Today we are celebrating the feast of Christ the King. Christ the King, we celebrate the way in which this age that we are living in will at one day come to an end, and the new age will begin. And today, as the feast of Christ the King, marks in that way the end of the Christian year. And the new year begins for the Christian Church next week with the first week of Advent. With the coming of the new age, there is a judgment on the world and on all who inhabit the world, the nations of the world. And hence this gospel reading today from Matthew's Gospel is a part of that judgment, that story that Jesus speaks about. And this judgment is a part of, as I said, chapter 25, where Jesus' teaching is given to the disciples. One of the first things that we need to recognize and to note about this reading today is to ask the question, who is it that Jesus is speaking to, and who is it that Jesus is speaking about? It is absolutely clear from the scripture that the people who Jesus is speaking to is not the crowds, not the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, but he's speaking to his friends. He's speaking to the disciples. As it were, he's sitting down, listening, and he's talking to them. And he's saying to them in a very, very clear way that it's not so much what you think or what you believe at the end of the day. What really matters is what you do. In other words, how you care for each other, how you love each other. Hence he talks about giving to each other when you're thirsty and when you're hungry. And later on he talks about welcome. He's talking about how the church should be. Jesus is talking about how we need to give to each other. And I've spoken about that principle of giving, which is at the heart of the church, as it has always been. And then Jesus' criticism of the disciples will be for those who haven't given to each other. Right? This is what the gospel is saying today. So the most profound thing in the gospel today is the importance of not what we say, not what we think, not what we believe even, but what we do. Notice the way in which this truth is apparent when the other people, what sometimes is referred to as the goats or the unrighteous, says to the king, who says, if you like, to Jesus, the Son of Man, "Well, when did we see you?" They were clearly acknowledging and knew who Jesus was, that he was the king. But in Jesus' eyes, the fact they acknowledged him as king was not enough. It's what they did, or more truly to say, what they didn't do. And sometimes that, if not most of the time, is what's really important in our life. It's not so much what we do, but more a case of what we don't do. In the story today, we can talk also about the way in which the king is angry with the people. We can ask the question, well, well, why is Jesus so angry? Well, I've already indicated one reason, that is, the way in which the church, the disciples, who Jesus is speaking to, have not cared for each other, who have, as it were, not put others before themselves, who have left each other, as it were, abandoned or in need. So Jesus, is angry in that way, you could say. The Son of Man is angry. Just in the same way as parents can get angry with their children when they do not care for each other. But perhaps more importantly, and the most startling part of this gospel, what Jesus is saying, is that last little phrase from the gospel that I read today, which Jesus says, what you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, the family, you did it also for me. In other words, the giving to each other, that principle of giving, is not simply giving to each other, it's giving to Christ himself. So we can say the Son of Man, the King, is angry and frustrated and in anguish because he has been abandoned. He hasn't been fed. He hasn't been given something to drink. He hasn't been visited in prison. He hasn't been welcomed. Christ has been abandoned because people, the disciples, perhaps, haven't given to each other. They haven't recognized that to give to each other is to give to Christ, and to refuse and not to give to each other is to refuse and not to give to Christ. What we see here, as well as that principle of giving that I've spoken about, we see this other fundamental principle that I've spoken about, which is about sharing. In a very deep way, we see how Christ shares his life with his friends, his disciples, and is expecting the disciple, his followers, his family, to share their life with each other. Now, this concentration, if you like, on thought concerning the disciples, the church, doesn't in any way detract from the importance for the church to give to the world. Hence the importance of setting aside this parable and this teaching with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan who, if you like, is seen in that context a part of the family, a stranger, almost an enemy. So we are to give to each other, and we are to give to the world. And the thing is this: where do we find the energy? Where do we find the will to give? Not only to each other, but to the world, to the needs and the sufferings of the world. We find that energy and the will and the spirit to put into practice this fundamental principle of church life, of giving, by putting into practice that fundamental principle of sharing. And that fundamental principle of sharing is lived out and expressed for what we call in the church fellowship. Fellowship is about socializing together. Fellowship is about being with another person, and often more importantly, being with a group of people who you can share something of your life with, something of your hopes, your dreams, your fears. Being in a situation where you share things deeply, where you can be trusted and where you trust, where you can be family, where things can be forgiven. Fellowship being sharing the things of God, speaking to and listening to each other, what God is calling us to, what God is saying to us. Remember this when we talk about this principle of sharing, which creates the energy and the will and the spirit through God's Spirit and grace to give. Remember these words from the Gospel of St. John. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give unto you. Love one another as I have loved you. In this way, people will know that you are my disciple." There is no greater love than when a friend lays down his life for another. These words are speaking about the importance of fellowship, mission. They're talking about the principles of sharing and giving. And the gospel today is fundamentally about the way in which, as I've said, it's what we do that matters, and it's about how we relate to each other and the world around us. So 2 thoughts that take these words and this gospel to heart today. We can say this: unless we are building the Christian community together, then we are in fact, through our inactivity, pouring it down. We can say that unless we are actually giving and sharing with each other and to the world, then we are not simply doing nothing, we are doing something that is negative. Jesus said, "Love one another as I have loved you. Then people will know that you are my disciples." It is with these truths that we enter into the beginning of the new year. As we look towards Christmas, and Christmas is fundamentally, when it comes, an expression of what it is to be given by God, to share with God, what it is to receive from God, which encourages us, through Christ, to share, give, and receive from each other, so as to give, share, and receive from the world. Worship, fellowship, mission. May God bless you in this coming week. God guide you, keep you, and open your heart and your eyes to what the Spirit is saying to the church and in your own heart.